Good evening, friends. Welcome to the Dawn Farm Education Series. My name is Mark Abelov. I'm a therapist at Dawn Farm Downtown, and I'm the Education Series Coordinator. Tonight's program, Grief and Loss in Addiction and Recovery, will be presented by Janice Fern and Barb Smith. Janice received her MSW from the University of Michigan and a PhD in palliative care from Lancaster University. She is part of the palliative care consultation team at the University of Michigan Health System. She also recently began working as the clinical ethicist in the newly established Program for Clinical Ethics, a joint University of Michigan and Center for Bioethics and Social Sciences and Medicine program. Barb Smith is a frequent public speaker and is the author of Brent's World, a book about her son. Please help me welcome Janice and Barb.
Hi everybody, I'm Janice. Can you hear me okay? All right. If at any point you can't hear me, just wave. And I'll interpret it as, we'll see. I might wave back. All right, so we're going to talk about grief and loss. And just a couple of words before I get started. This is a really heavy topic. It's a difficult thing to talk about. And as we go through different examples and touch on different areas, I think it can really hit home about any of the losses we've experienced too. It may make us think about them in a kind of a new way, even if it's been a while since we've had that loss. And because of that, I would just say when we're done, be nice to yourself. Like, you might need a little extra sleep. Grief is exhausting. Even talking about it for an hour and a half can be emotionally exhausting because grief is hard work. And we'll talk about that a little bit too. All right, so the sort of overview for the evening would be why we should talk about grief, and I'll go into that in a little bit. Why do we experience grief? Like, what is this thing and why do I have to feel this way? Some of the theories, and then I want to talk a little bit about specifically in addiction and recovery, what are some of the areas of grief that come up. And I also want to talk about what helps, because I think that's really important too. For ourselves and for those we're trying to support, knowing what helps is really empowering. All right, so why talk about grief? Well, anytime a change occurs, there's a loss. So change happens all the time in our life, which means that we experience loss all the time in our life. And we might not even be aware of that loss. In the handout packets, I've got that life events scale. And you think about if you go through that and see all the changes you might not even have really been aware of even in the last few months. Those are opportunities to experience grief because of the loss and that change. And change actually and grief can accompany good things. For example, I got married in July. I'm really excited about that. That's great. I really like my husband. He's a great guy. But I got married at 35. And so being single for a while, I had a really strong identity as a single person. And it was actually sad to give that up, even though I was really happy and very much freely entering into that new state of life, right? So just because something's good and I'm choosing it doesn't mean I don't have to mourn or grieve over the thing that the change is occurring about, okay? So change is inevitable, but I think growth can actually be optional. And maybe Walt Disney actually said this, it gets attributed to him. But I think where the change comes, that growth comes, is how we integrate that thing that is that the identity ourselves that is leaving and take on that new self. And how we work through and experience those emotions around grief to integrate more fully into life again afterwards is really where the growth comes through life. And this happens all through life. And so really the point of talking about grief, of working through our grief, is that we want to be more fully in the world, right? More present to ourselves, to the people around us, more present in the moment, more able to fully engage in life. And we only really do that if we can work through and accept what's been lost. So why do we experience grief? Well, because we get attached to things. And that's actually good. We should be attached to things. Now, the challenge is we can be attached to things that aren't good for us, and then that's not so good. We can be attached to things that are not attached back, or attached to people who are not attached back to us in the same way. And so hopefully we have a secure attachment where it's consistent. I know like the person on the other end of that relationship, how they're going to behave, what I can expect from them, that I can trust them to show up, right? But we know that that's not every attachment that we have. We can be attached to our substance of choice. We can be attached to chaos. Those things are not good for us, but we do get attached to them. So anytime that changes, even if it's a change we choose and it's good for us, there's going to be some loss in that previous when we let that go. We can have avoidant relationships where we just don't want to enter into attachments and we avoid people or responsibilities or things like that. And we might have anxious ones where there's no consistency with the thing that we're attached to. It's very chaotic. I don't know what to expect. Yesterday it was good, today it might not be so good, and that chaos makes us really anxious and hard to make new attachments. But for better or worse, we're attached to things. And when that thing goes away or that person goes away, we're going to experience grief. It can be complicated if it was more anxious or more ambivalent and not secure, but we can still grieve. So the other reasons we experience grief is because we're whole people, right? So there's a lot to make us who we are. And we have a personality, we have a character, right? I've got a past. I've got a cultural background. Maybe within my family there's some own cultures. I've got roles in my family. I've got roles at work, things that are expected. I've got relationships, right? I don't exist without other people. I'm a political being, right? I have agency. I can vote. I have rights. I get to do things, so I've got function, right? I can walk to the other side of the room if I want to. I should exercise more, whatever that might be. I've got regular behaviors. I kind of get up in the morning and I kind of know this is my routine, and this is what I'm going to do today, and this is what I expect to have happen today. And I've got a body, so I can experience pain, I can experience hunger. I've got a secret life, as in hopes and dreams that I might not have even shared with somebody yet, and things I expect about the future, and maybe a transcendent dimension, right? What gives me meaning, where do I connect to my higher power? All those pieces, right? So that's a lot of places where something could change, and that change and that impact of that change could be loss and grief, right? Could cause loss and grief. And so that means there's lots of areas, and death being probably the biggest one, the most obvious one that might come to mind about loss. But if my roles change, if my expectations, think about when the day doesn't go exactly how you thought, right? There's like this response there that we have to work through to kind of then re-engage and get on with life that day, right? So there's lots of places where we experience those things. And so because we're whole people, our grief is going to be expressed in a lot of different ways. And I think there's some similarities in our grief, right? There's some ways we can share about and find, oh yeah, that other person's having a somewhat similar experience of grief. But I think the perception of it is key. What might be very upsetting for me, with my own history of loss and my own family cultural background and support and maybe idea of spirituality, could have very little impact on someone else, right? So there's some personal uniqueness to that grief. And that individual response then is going to be unique. I think sometimes the frequency of exposure, so like I've had one loss and then another and another. I work in the hospital and people will go through the list of, I got admitted, and then like my schedule's not my own today, and then they told me this other bad news about a test, and this other, and you can hardly wrap your mind around one loss and change before you get hit with the next one, right? So that's going to impact how you respond. And then we know social support, and this quality of that social support also impacts how people respond. So I think there's shared reality in grief and loss, but also it's very unique. I think of families where a mother might have died, so she's the mother of the children, but she's somebody's wife and somebody's sister and somebody's daughter. And while they all lost the same person, it was unique relationships between each of them, and only they, like mother-daughter, had that specific relationship. So while they're all grieving the loss of the same person, their expression of that, their experience of that, the specific relationship that was lost is unique to them. All right. So going back to that whole person idea and the uniqueness of the loss means that as a psychosocial, spiritual person, this whole person, that means we're going to have emotional responses to loss, potentially mental, social, spiritual, and physical, all of these ways. So grief is very all-consuming sometimes. So some examples of emotional, and I wrote these down so I don't forget all of them. But I think, so emotional, some people feel relief, thinking about maybe somebody who was a very long illness, and the first emotional response you have is relief that maybe someone's suffering is done. Some people might feel really angry, how dare you leave me, right? Sad is the obvious one that comes to mind, but sometimes people just feel shock or numb initially or not sure how to feel, right? So there's a lot of different things. Physical, some people will tell me they feel hot or cold or hungry or not hungry or really tired. Maybe just like they're just moving slow, more fatigued over time, just not the same amount of energy. You might see tears, right? Sometimes people cry and sometimes people don't. Cognition, so thoughts about really just this longing and this yearning and thinking about what was lost a lot. Whether that is a person or a ritual or a place, whatever that might be. Some people will tell me too that they kind of have just senses of they'll look around the corner and be like, oh, I thought that was Susie. And then we're like, well, no, Susie's not here, right? So that you think you see somebody out of the corner of your eye who's not there. Behavioral stuff, people might sleep more, they might cry, they might need a little more time by themselves or a little more space or only have so much energy to engage in social things that day. And spiritual, a lot of folks will talk about trying to find meaning in things and asking why. Why did this happen? How could it have happened? Maybe if I know the details or something. And then where's God in this if you're particularly spiritual or religious? Or how does my religion tell me, does it help me cope with this or not? Where is that? All sort of range of emotions that are very normal. And the challenge is in a family, is thinking about that family I just described where the mom died and all those different people. They could all be having different emotions at the same time. And I think that's challenging when you're sitting in the room and somebody is having a very different emotion than you are about things. When talking about grief, I think it's also important to talk about depression because you can have both at the same time. I think sometimes it's really important to sit down and try to figure out, is this grief, is this depression, is it both? Because they're a little bit different. A lot of folks who are grieving will talk about feeling like grief is a roller coaster. As in, all of a sudden they're laughing, they're like, oh, I forgot to be sad. When I talk to families who are sitting vigil around a dying person's bed, they're telling stories and laughing about, remember when grandma did this really funny thing and how grandpa did, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh, I'm sad. And so it's back and forth, and they might find, today I'm engaging well in life, and tomorrow I'm kind of tired. But they can relate it back to a specific event. I know I'm sad because of this thing that happened. And I can see that change and move over time. And I miss something, but I can think about the future. I can plan for the future. I'm engaging in the future. I'm building a future, even though this thing that I lost is no longer here, right? A lot of folks then will tell me depression feels more like a dead end, like I'm stuck. There's not a specific event to relate it to. It might be more inward turning, like it's some self-loathing or feeling worthless, feeling like there is no future, like I can't engage, like I actually have no emotions. I don't feel sad, I don't feel happy, there's not this roller coaster piece, I just feel numb. And so sitting down with someone, a professional, to talk about, is this grief, is this depression, is it both? Because adequately addressing the depression can really help then free someone up to work through the grief pieces too. But I think it's worth assessing because people jump sometimes, unless you go in depth about what's going on, to, oh, this is depression, when it might really be grief. And it's important because grief gets addressed differently than depression. All right, so a couple myths and facts after all of that, just to make sure we're all still together. All right, so based on everything I've just said, the pain of the loss will go away faster if I ignore it. So this is a myth. It doesn't. I don't know if anyone knows the little kid song about the bear. You can't go under it. You can't go over it. I shouldn't sing to you. But you gotta go through it, right? That's a little ditty. But I think the only way through grief, you can't go around it and you can't go under it. And not being real about your feelings doesn't help you feel any better, and it doesn't help you work through the grief or find that new identity or engage in life on the other side. So as painful as it is, that process of experiencing those emotions and working through them actually is the only way to feel better. It's important to be strong in the face of loss. This is also a myth. It's important to be real about how you feel. Again, going back to that first point, if we're not real about how we feel, then we won't be able to work through things in the same way. Now, I think a caveat to this, I often talk with parents, and I think it's important as parents to teach our children how to grieve and how to grieve well, because it's a life lesson that will help them in the future. But and kids need to know it's okay to be sad, and sometimes you mirror that by showing tears and things yourself as the parent, right? But if you're feeling so out of control, like I just need to sob, then maybe I'm going to do that in the bathroom or away from my child. So I think there's a range of emotions depending on the developmental age of the child that you might show them, for example, and then what you might need to do with your spouse or with your therapist or whatever that might be more intense grieving. And so I think there's times and places for things, but it's important to know, why am I maybe not showing the full depth of my grief right now? Well, I don't want to overwhelm my 2-year-old. That makes sense, right? That's not inappropriately tampering that emotion, but it needs to come out somewhere, and it needs to come out in an authentic way. All right, so if you don't cry, it means you're not sorry about the loss. This is also a myth. And this isn't, I'm just being strong, so I'm not going to show my tears. This is sometimes, I'm just so tired. I can't cry right now, or I just don't have tears left at the moment, or I do just kind of feel shock and numb because it was so recent, or whatever it might be. So tears are often how we express our grief, but they're not the only way. And just because someone doesn't cry doesn't mean they're sad. And this can be, I think, stereotypical sometimes to say, oh, men don't cry and women do, but that's not true either. Oftentimes women don't and men do cry. So it's not necessarily one way or the other per gender. It's just sometimes we do cry and sometimes we don't. And then this is my maybe least favorite myth. Grief lasts about a year. And I'm sorry to say it, but I think grief lasts, and it just lasts. Now it changes. It can be less intense, but if we were really attached to something, we never really lose that attachment. I think about sort of like your life like a tapestry, and a weaver weaves strand after strand, and it builds this long, big thing. Well, the grief might be this purple thread right here, and you get time and space as more gets woven on, but you don't lose the connection to that. It's still part of who you are, for better or worse, that like whether you are healthily attached to the thing or not, but it's who you are, and because of it, it's who you're becoming now. So you get maybe further away from it, but it changes, but it's still there. And it's gonna spike up again on maybe an anniversary, or I was talking to somebody, their husband always did the taxes, and so when it's tax time, they actually grieve in a different way, because it's like that role is not filled anymore, and they miss them again, and he really liked doing the taxes. I don't know very many people like doing their taxes, but he did. And so like just mourning that kind of anew, and that comes every year, whether you want it to or not. And so it kind of is a resurgence of that grief, but it's different over time, and that's normal. And it can kind of surprise us, because you think you're going along like, oh, and then, oh, boom, that grief again. So that's, again, that roller coaster I was talking about. All right, so why talk about some theories? I think theories are helpful tools for understanding and trying to explain some of reality, but they aren't the explanation for the reality that we experience. So I think it's helpful to have several different tools, and kind of hold on and say, how does my grief or my experience fit in with this? But they're not prescriptive. They don't tell, but I think they're just kind of helpful to have some conceptualization, to then have some conversations, kind of as a springboard for some of those conversations. So I'm going to start with Kubler-Ross, which I think probably most folks are familiar with. And she sometimes gets a bad rap because her theory came out so long ago. But I really like her theory. I think it's when the change initially just happens, I think it's it's kind of, I do see some of these things going on in my life. Now, I don't recommend walking up to someone and being, I think you're in bargaining. No one likes to be analyzed like that. And I would also say on the flip side to say, I know I'm in bargaining does not help you get through the bargaining phase anymore. So knowing where you are is not the same thing, and naming it is not the same thing as actually naming the emotions, experiencing the emotions and working through them, right? I wish it was as easy as just labeling, I'm angry, and I'll be in bargaining in a few minutes or whatever, but it doesn't work that way. So this denial, shock, disbelief is often a common response to maybe even thinking about hearing bad news about something, right? Or actually my expectations being totally thrown out the window for my day. Like I lost my car keys. There is a moment where you're like, I didn't lose my car keys. I know, and you're like looking through your bag again for the 10th time because they have to be there, but they're not, right? So I mean, it happens for little things and it happens for big things. I sometimes call this the it can't be, let it be Tuesday again piece. So I actually had a bad thing happen to me on a Wednesday once. And all for the next 3 months, I was like, I just wish it was Tuesday again. It has to, and in some ways, that was not helpful. It didn't help actually work through any of the emotions or acknowledge that the loss had occurred. So we need to be able to acknowledge those facts, right? To kind of that's to move forward and start working on some of those things. And anger, I think, is also a very natural response to a big change. And it can feel kind of safe, right? It somehow is easier and more acceptable to feel angry in our culture than it is to feel sad or acknowledge that sadness. So I think just sometimes I'm aware of that too. Like, am I really angry, or is this masking actually some sadness and some grief, and I need to look at that? And I think it's like bargaining just says if I promise to always hang my keys on this hook, then I'll never lose them again, and then I'll never be late to work, and there we go. But it doesn't work that way, right? And then this depression, I think in this case, it's not clinical depression, but just that sadness of this great sense of loss. I'm aware of it, and sometimes more aware of my own vulnerability or my own mortality, right? Things that were lost. And then the acceptance piece is that acceptance, being able to live with something, that it has to be faced. And again, we bounce, so this is not linear. We bounce around them. We can be in 4 at the same time. But sort of trying to recognize where some of those emotions might help us talk about them and kind of figure out what would be helpful moving forward. Another model is called the dual process model, and I actually really like this. It talks about adaptive coping. It's a mix of bouncing back and forth from experiencing the emotion and then maybe doing some actually practical work. So go back to the example of my lady with the taxes, right? She might be grieving, but she actually has to learn how to do the taxes. And it's okay to say, I'm not going to be solely immersed in my grief right now and my feelings of those emotions. I'm going to learn how to do the taxes. Both of those are moving her forward in the grieving process, but she needs to go back and forth, actually. It's a combination of practical pieces and the grieving pieces, too, that are part of healing from grief or working through grief. And if folks have questions about the models afterwards, I'm happy to answer those. All right, another one that I think is a kind of helpful tool in my toolbox is this theory by Martin Doka. And when they talk about grieving styles, and they talk about intuitive and instrumental. And I think some of these can be learned. So the intuitive might be emphasizing the expression of emotion, and that can be personality-wise. So they're clear to see this is not gender-based. This is a lot to do with personality and maybe cultural, and within our own families, within our broader culture, or maybe a learned style. So the instrumental might be focusing more on that practical models and problems. So that model I just showed you, the dual processing, some folks might spend more time in the emotional side, and some might spend more time on the practical side, but there is still both, right? So this is personality related. I noticed that I probably was more of an intuitive, emotional griever, but after working in healthcare for a really long time, I think I've learned to be more instrumental in my grieving. And so neither is good or bad or better than the other. It's just, again, they can be learned over time. All right, and so I'm going to spend a little more time on this last theory, which is William Worden's, and he talks about 4 tasks of mourning. And so these are them briefly. Accept the reality of the loss, experience and work through the pain of the grief, adjust to the new normal, life without what was lost, and then emotionally relocate that loss and move forward. So as you can see, some of these are kind of reflective of what I was talking about. They kind of have they share elements between each of them. They're not totally distinct, because some of these sound a little bit like what Kubler-Ross was talking about. And in order to do some of these tasks, you'd have to focus on practical stuff and emotional stuff. All right, so to accept the reality of the loss. It's really to come face to face with it and kind of to come to the realization that you can't regain it, that it's not reversible, right? I think about a couple of breakups I had over time. It's hard to accept the reality of that loss because the person is still walking around. So you keep thinking, maybe they'll call me, or maybe I'll run into them, or maybe we can get back together, or whatever it is. And over time, there are other things I have to accept about the reality of the loss. But I think this can be really hard when we might have, out of choice, have to separate ourselves or end a relationship because it's not healthy for us, or that's not the best way to love that person anymore. And it's really hard to accept that that might not be reversible. I also think part of accepting the reality of the loss is knowing the facts around something. So this happens a lot. I think about in instances of war where someone might have died. You might not know all the facts that went into that. And so trying to accept that reality and what happened. We want facts. That's what's going on. Why did this happen, right? And those aren't always available to us. We might always not know what someone was thinking or feeling. And that's really hard. So part of the obstacles would be either denying the facts of the loss as much as we know them, or even maybe denying the meaning of the loss, like negating it. Like, this didn't mean that much, or I didn't really like him that much, or those places and friends were not that important to me, whatever it might be, and saying it's not a big deal. So part of this reality is like, this is a big deal. This meant a lot. That was an important relationship. It may not have been a healthy one, but it was important. And it had a lot of influence. And this is all the things it meant to me. And trying to work through all those pieces. So then the second task, and again, these are not prescriptive or all in order. They could happen back and forth. But to experience and work through the pain. Again, this is the can't go over it, can't go under it, can't go around it, can only go through it. If you're deeply attached to something, then it's a part of allowing yourself to feel all the things that attachment meant. So cutting off your feelings, denying that the pain is present, again, maybe avoiding reminders of the loss. Now, there might be some safety things you might need to do. Like, it might not be good to go around and hang out with old friends or old places if those are going to facilitate behaviors that you no longer want to engage in, right? So there's some practical pieces there. But it might be, for example, I have somebody who she just won't drive by the hospital at all. She'll totally reroute her whole way home to and from work so that she doesn't have to go by the hospital because it's too much of a reminder of the reality of the loss. So part of this is thinking about like knowing what those triggers are, planning for them in a safe way, and maybe working up to some things. And I think if this is a struggle, if this is a challenge, if you're stuck here, then it's important to get, I think, professional help to kind of work through what's going to be safe still for me, but also what ways might not need to acknowledge how I really feel about this, or the things that I might be denying that are keeping me from working through that pain. So then 3 is sort of adjusting to that, the new normal. And this is sort of a reminder of that like dual processing model, right? So there's external adjustments, right? How it impacts your everyday functioning in the world, and then how it impacts your sense of self internally, and spiritual adjustments, like how does this impact my beliefs, my values, my assumptions about the world, and what does it mean about who maybe God is for me, or what does it mean about just what's fair, what can I expect out of life, what does this loss mean there? And things that might handicap us from moving forward here would be promoting our own helplessness, refusing to learn new skills or new roles, or engaging in life, maybe withdrawing from the world, or maybe refusing to see the world or myself differently. So going back to my example of it's got to be Tuesday, that need to get back to Tuesday so that Wednesday didn't happen really kept me from working through this piece and identifying what skills needed to be there. Like, who am I? If this loss did occur, who am I now? And instead of dealing with that, I just pretended it was the day before the loss occurred. And then so 4 would be to emotionally relocate. And again, think of that tapestry. You don't lose the relationship, but you're still connected in a way that helps you engage in life still. So it's both. I'm connected, but I'm engaging in life. So obstacles would be to withdraw from your others, from new relationships, unwillingness to love or risk in a healthy way, to be vulnerable in a healthy way, or holding so tight to the past that you're unable to form new relationships. So I think this is, how did this relationship that I lost, this thing that I lost still has great meaning to me, and I want to, but not in a way that hinders me from forming new attachments, from engaging in life, from saying, I'm willing to invest here, I'm willing to take a risk with a new relationship, that vulnerability. So I don't mean risk in an unsafe way, but if every healthy relationship still involves an element of risk of putting yourself out there, saying, here I am, I'm allowing myself to be seen, right, for who I really am, and engaging in a relationship that way. All right. So I think what's take home from this, or summarize that, would be that if we spare ourselves from grief, I think we also spare ourselves from feeling true joy and from that fullness of life and that being really engaged in life. And my hope is for all of us that as we deal with our endings, we do find new beginnings. So I'm going to transition to talking about addiction and recovery. So when I think about addiction and how grief might be involved in that, I think sometimes our unresolved grief, our trauma, the effect that has on us might be sort of what precipitates our use. We might be using to numb that, to forget that, right? I think that our experience of grief and loss can be compounded in addiction. While we might have had those previous losses, there's a lot of other losses that come along when we're dealing with addiction. And that grief and loss can be complicated by use. So if we're numbing with our drug of choice, then we're not experiencing those emotions, we're not working through them, we're not available to engage in life again, because we just keep numbing. I also think the losses get minimized. Again, that piece of that doesn't really matter, or that happens to everybody, or I was working with a woman who in recovery said she didn't realize all the times she'd had bad sexual encounters that was actually assault, and she just minimized it and said, I think that just happens. And really, it's like, no, it doesn't happen. And talking through that should never have happened to you, and working through those pieces, right? So it just gets really normalized, and then that it makes it harder to deal with when it seems really normal. I think when we've experienced a deep loss and grief and that affront to who am I and trying to search for meaning, sometimes we can use our alcohol or drug of choice to cope with it, right? Oftentimes it gets complicated. Our grieving gets complicated because we don't have a good, strong support system. Remember, I mentioned that having a support system is key to working through grief. And we might medicate to avoid or minimize our feelings. We're not processing that grief, and therefore they're not fully grieved, and they might be piling up on each other over time. So I think one of the biggest losses I think about is our loss of self, right? I lose my integrity, that guilt, that shame that I might have lied. I wasn't true to who I am. I wasn't true to the potential that I thought I should live up to, whatever that might be. Maybe loss of sense of spiritual self or connection to our more that transcendent piece I was talking about. I think other losses we might experience would be just events. I wasn't present for the event. I might have been there physically, but I wasn't present, whether it was my grandpa's funeral or the birth of my first child, or my daughter's high school graduation, whatever that might be. or maybe not being present at all for and missing it altogether. Relationships with family and friends get strained, right? And there's lots of losses there. In the roles that you might have were supposed to play in the family, the expectations for the future, thinking about that whole person I talked about at the beginning. All the people in our lives have expectations about the future and hopes and secret aspirations that about what they want life to look like. And all of those can be affected. Maybe you've lost parenting time, whether we weren't there for it, or maybe we might have been incarcerated or things like that, so we couldn't be present. Particular family milestones, just time. Like, where did all that time go? I don't have a sense of time. Opportunities. So whether that's the promotion at work or moving to a new city, whatever that might have been, going back to school, finishing school. A lot of people talk about having perinatal loss during this, losing pregnancies. And just the spiritual loss of not knowing who I am or my sense of purpose or my meaning, those sorts of things. So that's a lot to grieve. That is a lot. And that's going to take time. And it's going to take support. And it's going to take help. But going back to what I was saying, that the growth comes from working through those things, that this quote of we don't, if we don't grieve, we hardly exist. That growth, that transformation, that change, that full engagement in life comes through working through those things. So what about moving from addiction into recovery, right? So there's what are you leaving behind? I think about where is it acceptable to talk about, I was really attached to my drug of choice. That was my primary relationship. And how do you talk about that and where do you talk about that, right? So the loss of the drug itself, potentially loss of rituals around it, or locations, or places, or friends, or maybe loss of chaos, right? Loss of the inability to predict things. So as you get into recovery, and all the things that have been numb or that you've been wanting to numb come to your realization and they're there, that's a lot. So Michael Block says, be prepared to experience emotions in a new way, right? And of course, the number one response to this is immediately I want to go back to numbing that. I don't want to feel this way. This feels yucky. And I think some of the barriers to this would be, again, not having good social support around you, because having a plan in place for what to do when you start feeling cravings again and the need to numb. Also the lack of safety and trust. So I think, again, being in a place with people who you can learn to grow in trust with is important. This inability to feel or identify feelings. I was thinking, one of my colleagues at work always says, well, I've got the feels today. And I was like, actually, that makes me crazy, I hate that word, the feels. I think it's really important to say, what are you feeling, actually? What can we name it? There are these color wheels that have all these different words. I think words are amazing. So am I angry? Am I pissed? Am I furious? Am I what? That tells me a lot more about what's going on with you, right? Well, it takes a long time to learn to gauge my own feelings about where I am on each of those scales. We don't just come out knowing how to do that. Little kids need a lot of help about expressing their emotions and understanding what those emotions mean and how emotions are different from behaviors and all those sorts of things. So if we've been numbing for a while with our drug of choice, learning this piece is a big part of recovery, and it takes time. But if you like to color those coloring wheels with am I pissed or am I angry, there's lots of them online. So you can get a whole vocabulary of feeling words. And so that when our feelings unfreeze and we don't have names for them, that's really overwhelming. That's exhausting. It's scary, actually, right? So being in a place where we can work through with a group of people who support us about what is this feeling, what's it really mean, what's it actually telling me, am I safe, not safe, those sorts of things. Because previously you would know, right, and not pay attention to that. And then a lot of conflicting, like one minute I'm happy, now I'm sad, I don't know. And that's hard to work through, like how can I feel 15 things at once? And that's overwhelming too, because previously I was just feeling numb. So again, social support is super important. And being in a recovery program is super important for helping this. And we don't just come out and grow up knowing how to have healthy coping skills. They are things that are learned over time, and if we've been numbing or missing out on a lot of those pieces of when those get learned, then we need to learn them now. And again, that's a process. So again, being around folks who can support us in identifying and coming up with good coping skills is important. And then as we get into recovery, and we might realize, all the things that we're guilty about, or the shame, or the stigma, or the traumas. And all of that is going to complicate how we're feeling and how we're working through things too. So again, this idea of time and grief and working through it, and it's going to take time. And it can be done, and it can be done with a good support system in place. So this inability or unwillingness is going to stop it from it. And so being in a safe place and being willing to try, getting the support we need to try is really important. So I think grief work is a lot like addiction recovery, right? It's not a linear process, and it doesn't happen all at once. And we learn how to live with our grief as we learn how to live in recovery. And so I think there's a lot of similarities to those pieces, right? In recovery, you acknowledge, understand, and accept the losses and move through grief. Like recovery is about dealing with this grief, with the light at the end of the tunnel being, I'm more engaged in life. I am more fully alive. I'm more authentically myself, and regaining that integrity that we want, right? So some of the things that recovery helps with that I think work really well with this process of grief is you develop skills to cope with our feelings. You have a safe spot to open up and identify and talk about those losses. And people are going to be able to, the loss might be unique to you. There are, again, those similarities. So you can gain strength and wisdom from the folks around you and be able to share your wisdom and your strength with folks. You identify those feelings and you get to verbalize them. And this ability to tolerate negative feelings. Again, it's about being honest about how I am really feeling and being able to sit with that feeling that might be a little more icky. I don't want to be sad, but I am sad, and so how do we work through that? And then it's an opportunity to develop new attachments, new relationships, and again, that's about investing in the future and investing in yourself being fully alive. You can develop new rituals. Everyone's drinking coffee. And my dad still chews gum. He's Trident gum. It's like always a pack of Trident gum. And he quits, this is smoking, he quit smoking when I was born. So I just told you I was 35 in July. So he still chews through multiple packs of gum. And if you always want a piece of gum, you just find my dad. Recovery offers opportunities to grieve those lost relationships, right? To heal old ones, to build new ones. And I think it helps us make meaning of the past, to put it in a narrative and a story and a history and find a place for it. I think if we can't go back and say sorry to someone who is gone, right, if someone's died, there are ways we can still heal that relationship or maintain integrity or regain integrity there. And folks do that with letters or maybe making some type of meaning out of that loss, making that relationship matter now in a new way. It offers an opportunity in recovery to connect with your spiritual self, that transcendent self, whether that's specific religious beliefs or just the idea of making meaning and purpose and regaining that sense of self. I want to talk a little bit about family and loved ones. So this is a lot on this slide. This gets back to the idea of when someone is, as a family member of someone who is experiencing addiction, again, they could be present, but never actually, like physically present, but not actually mentally or emotionally or role or task-wise present to you. So It can be very, very difficult to grieve a loss of somebody who is still physically around. And that is often a situation that many family members are in, is that their loved one is still there but not present to them in a real and meaningful way. So losses for families could be those relationships as well. I think financial security, potentially the hopes and dreams, self-esteem, for them as well, social standing, maybe some ideas of having to lie for your spouse about why they're not at work, or make excuses for your child, or opportunities get denied you too, or you don't feel safe, you don't feel confident or empowered to take new opportunities because you're trying to cover for someone. Which again, your own integrity then gets sacrificed in this piece too, and your sense of self. And there might be other tangible things that go along with that, I think too, but a lot of just that whole person, again, experiences loss. And the loss gets complicated by all kinds of feelings. Like, I love this person and I resent them at the same time. So grieving that change in that relationship while you resent and love and back and forth, and again, those conflicting emotions all there. That stigma or secrecy or shame, so you're not being honest about how you feel or expressing your emotions well. And then there might be separation of being able to contact them, that is because they are incarcerated, or there might actually be a death. So I think the tension for families as they're going from addiction into recovery is sort of this idea between they're on a continuum of moving towards hope and towards acceptance, and trying to make meaning out of things as well, and accepting this idea of interdependence and being connected in things, and maybe that making attachments, moving from ambiguity somewhere to certainty of outcome. Not that we can always be certain about the future. It's hard to predict the future. But moving away from that chaos to more predictability. That actually can be, we can get really used to chaos. It can be really uncomfortable when the chaos goes away. And the idea of vacillating between, again, then making plans, experiencing emotions, working on tasks, and then talking about how you feel. And then moving away from the family as it was to the family as it's becoming, in the same way that the person in recovery is moving away from who they were before and moving towards who they're becoming on the other side of recovery. I think when talking about all this, you can see there's lots of people involved, and they all feel different ways, even though they might be going through very similar experiences. So I think grief can actually feel really lonely. You can sort of feel like, I'm alone in this, because you see other people having emotions that are different than yours, and because the relationship of the thing that was lost is unique to you. So while there are, again, that similarities, it can feel really lonely sometimes. And that can be challenging then for working through things. It can be hard to say, well, actually, I feel really differently than the rest of my family does about this loss. So having a safe place to do that and getting support is really important as well. And if this isn't clear enough already, this is hard work. This is really hard work. It's going and working through grief is probably going to be some of the hardest work that you do, but it's really worthwhile work, and it's work that can be done. It might not be completely finished ever, but it can get better, and you can move forward. So talking about that, what helps? So the best therapy for grief is time and community. So my recommendations for folks who are grieving are that don't do it alone. And now this can mean I might need to get someone professional to talk to. Friends and family might fade over time sometimes. So making sure that you're clear about what you need and who can be there for you. Experience your feelings, which is, of course, way easier to say than do. And we just spent a lot of time talking about why that's important. I think it can be helpful to express your feelings in a tangible or creative way. I have, at the hospital, when we're grieving somebody who, a patient that we might have taken care of for a long time, well, sometimes as nurses, I've got a box with little rocks in it, and they can take a rock and they can hold on to it, and it's like a physical representation of their grief, and they can, in their head say the thoughts they want to the person who is gone, and then they can decide what they want to do with that stone. And a lot of them will put it in the river or bury it in their backyard, things like that. So I think sometimes it's helpful to have something to focus on and to look at things. And that might sound corny to some folks. So what works for somebody might not work for somebody else. But other people will plant trees or start programs, those sorts of things, right? Adult coloring books are all the rage right now, so you could color in a coloring book. I think it's also really important to look after your physical health. Again, this is a lot of hard work, and it's going to take a physical toll on you. So you being nice to yourself means I might need a little bit more time sleeping, or am I eating well? Am I exercising? The things that help me stay healthy, and paying attention to that. And of course, getting help from community is really important. So I think being in AA or NA, there's steps available. There's a process there's people to work through, and there's also a huge opportunity to make meaning by giving back to others and being part of that group and sharing openly with them. We talked about support from family and friends. I think it can be overwhelming when you're grieving to come up. People always say, well, let me know what I can do. That's such a wide open statement. I think the more specific we can be about, is it like, I know you're dealing with a lot right now. I'm going to Kroger. Can I pick you up some eggs? Like, trying to narrow it down a little bit can sometimes help. It's when you're really tired from grieving, it's like I have to think of how you can help me. It's really hard. So I try to take that burden off of the person who's grieving and kind of be specific about, can I pick something up after work for you? So as hard as that is, as much as we can in the midst of grieving, be specific about what we need to families and friends and coworkers. That can help. And again, support might change over time, so being able to see where we can get that from in a consistent way. I also think it's challenging because sometimes people just don't know what to say. Because really, there's not a lot to say. Like, grief is deep, and words are not going to come close to touching it sometimes. But there are things you can't or shouldn't say because they're really not helpful. So even well-meaning people who love us a lot and want to help can say some very unhelpful things. And it's okay to say, this is not the right place for me to seek support. Talking to a woman who've experienced a pregnancy loss, and like some people come up and say, oh, you can have another baby. Things like that, which are like not helpful. And I wanted that baby. I don't want another baby. I wanted this baby. And so I think people mean well, but it's not necessarily always helpful. And in this case, it might be actually really important then to get professional support, somebody who isn't as emotionally involved or close to it, but who can be there just for you in your corner, and who hopefully is trained to say things that are more helpful than unhelpful, and just be a listening ear for you. It can be important to seek spiritual support. A lot of different organized religions have, and churches and mosques and have grief support and groups and things available. And so a lot of folks will say engaging in those, the rituals of my faith, finding meaning that way is really helpful. And that works, again, for some people and might not work for others. Rituals, so ceremonies I think are important. There is something about grieving together as a community around something, about it, having that grief be visible, about acknowledging it, about having it acknowledged to you, that can be really healing too. And they affirm the life of the person who was lost. They might be a way to connect to community again too, and thinking about different groups that have causes now that came out of experiencing a loss. They've developed a new community around that and are doing good with that. And some of those ceremonies or things, so tributes, can be really helpful. A lot of folks talk about like building legacy, like what's this person's life going to mean? How can I honor them? And then I think things like adult coloring actually can be helpful. Music, art, expressions like those can help us recover as well. I prefer coloring books because my art doesn't look so good. I can do stick figures, which is why these are all pictures off of the internet and nothing I drew. Self-care is really important through the recovery and grieving process. It's funny. I have a busy work, and I see a lot of loss, and I work with a lot of grieving families in my at the hospital. And one of the things I do is like there's a time of day where I'm like I'm having a cup of tea, and it's actually something I say I'm doing this for me, and it's really so it's just a cup of tea, but I can give it a lot of meaning and a lot of in some ways a lot of power. I said, this is what I'm doing for me in my relaxation. I take a moment and I step back and I have a cup of tea. And that can be really helpful. So other things that could be helpful would be meditation. Again, making sure if things get off kilter for me, I have to go back to the basics. Like, have I been eating good, healthy food regularly? Am I sleeping well? Am I exercising? And it's amazing when I try to get those things back on track, how perspective changes and I have more energy and freedom to deal with the other things that are going on in life. Really important part of taking care of yourself, though, is knowing your grief triggers. If you know a holiday is coming up, like, let's make a plan for how I'm going to deal with that. And maybe I only go to Thanksgiving for 2 hours, and this is my escape plan is I'm going to go back home and do this other thing, because that's as much as I can take. Or specific dates, and knowing those are coming up and making a plan around them, particularly a plan for dealing with the grief, but also plan for dealing with any cravings that might, or things that those emotions might bring up, right, to make sure that we're moving forward with things. So anniversaries, sometimes national tragedies, hearing other people about having a similar experience, holidays. I left some blanks, so you can think of if in the losses you've experienced, what sort of makes that feel more fresh to you, and what do you need to do to be able to manage that. So moving forward to try to be healthy, identify your sources of support, talk about the grief you're experiencing, plan ahead, and then identify healthier, helpful alternatives if you can't participate in something specifically because it's going to be too difficult right now from a grief standpoint. So when is grief healed? I talked about it lasting for a while, but I don't think it's healed when it goes away, because again, I don't think it necessarily goes away. But maybe it's healed when I can think about what's lost without that acute pain, where that yearning, while still there for what was lost, that yearning might have decreased some. Maybe when the tasks are accomplished, or when I can think about what was lost without physical manifestations like crying, or that tightness in the chest, or that welling, that feeling you get behind your eyes right before you cry. Maybe it's healed when I can reinvest into a new relationship, or maybe when I just feel more hopeful, or there's some gratification. I feel like a healthy happiness or gratefulness. Or maybe I've learned new roles, thinking again about that grieving and then developing new roles. And again, I don't think there's a time limit. So when it isn't healing, sometimes it can be relational factors, like the difficulty of that attachment specifically. And that would be something to talk with if you find like, that's really still a struggle for me. It's been a long time. I've been doing what I think I need to do to take care of myself, to work through this grief. And I'm just feeling really stuck there. It might be sitting down with them with a therapist or a counselor and talking about what was it specific to this relationship that might be really difficult. And it might be circumstantial. I just don't know the details of it. And I'm really stuck. Like, if I just knew Y, or if I just knew X, then maybe I could move forward. Again, it would be helpful, I think, to meet with someone professionally to talk about that. Could be historical factors, as in I've had so many losses that I just can't grieve this one, or this loss right now is actually, which seemed like a small loss, but I think it's actually related to this loss way back here that I never ever dealt with. And so what's really going on there? And it might be those types of, if you think that might be what you're struggling with, again, I think talking with someone professionally about that to work on what from this experience is triggering something from back there, and how are they all mixed together. And then just sometimes personalities. Some of us have the ability to deal with more intense emotions than others, and we might need specific support around dealing with all the feelings that we're having. And sometimes we're having struggle moving through grief because we don't have a very intact social system or support. And so again, reconnecting with a group like through AA or NA or something so that you can be more connected to a support could be helpful. So if you're feeling stuck and you realize you're not actually in a place where you're getting good support or you're not connected to a support system, that might be a way to move forward as well. So we can have that chronic grief where it piles up, piles up, piles up. We can also have delayed grief reactions. Let's go back to the example I gave about the mom and her 2-year-old. Well, maybe she never grieved because she just had to get through the day and take care of the kids, and so actually she never let that loss. She never experienced it back then. She never showed it. When she decides to start dealing with it now or working through it now, it's going to be more challenging and might need some professional support around that too, because it just got. So folks coming back from war will tell us this too. There was a lot of things that happened there, and I just said no, I can't deal with it right now. I got to keep going, and that comes along, and that's a lot harder to deal with than in the present, and it needs professional support often in order to do that, for example, or avoiding grieving. Again, I'm just not going to do that. So I think, a couple more slides, and then Barb's going to come up. So I think, again, with therapy, the goal is not about forgetting, but remembering with less pain. It's going to help develop adaptive coping mechanisms, help make meaning, and there's a lot of different ways to get support and do that grief work. So if you're on the flip side of that and trying to help support somebody who's grieving, I think, again, listening is the most powerful thing that we can do, because the words just are not necessarily going to be enough. So that empathy says, I can't imagine what it is that you're going through, but please tell me, how can I'm really glad that you're sharing this with me. Thank you for doing that. Again, acknowledging the uniqueness of the grief. I might have lost my mom too as a high schooler, but while there's similarities, there also are things that are very unique, and being able to say, I might have some idea about what you're going through, but tell me what it's like for you, actually. Again, that offering of practical help, potentially making contact or writing notes. I actually like writing notes because people sometimes feel like I have to respond to it, or a text, I have to respond to it. Having something in paper doesn't require immediate response, is still supportive, and if you're really tired, trying to come up with an immediate response can be really hard. And again, grieving is exhausting. And then as you're trying to support somebody, being aware of those holidays and anniversaries. A friend of mine had a really hard time getting pregnant and got pregnant once and lost the pregnancy. And so I try to remember the date that she lost the pregnancy, but also the original due date. And so for the last couple of years, I send her a card just telling her I'm thinking of her on those 2 days. And I think that that can be really powerful, because people remember sometimes for the first year or the first anniversary, and it's the other ones after that people forget. All right, so I think all of what I want to say is that grieving allows us to heal, to remember with love rather than pain. It's a sorting process. One by one, you let go of the things that are gone, and you mourn for them. One by one, you take hold of the things that have become a part of you, who you are, and build again. So I think my hope for all of us as we go through this process is that we will be more fully alive. Thanks. I'm going to have Barb come out, and then we'll answer questions together.
Good evening. Thank you, Janice. That was wonderful. A lot of really good information. First of all, I want to thank Jess, for inviting me here. Jess is very special to my heart. And she was very special to my mom. My mom, Mary Lou, some of you might know her. She passed away December 21st. And I have her to thank for our family getting on the road to recovery. She was the one that, I grew up in an alcoholic home. My father's the alcoholic. He drank every single day of my life, of my childhood, except for 2 weeks when he was in the hospital with double pneumonia. But when he came home from the hospital, he resumed his drinking. So that's all I knew coming up, is drinking, violence, fighting, no one really getting taken care of properly. So I myself, as a teenager, started drinking. And that's one of the reasons why I left home at 17, because my mother was not going to allow me to drink. So I thought, I don't need this. I don't need you. I'm out of here. Well, that really isn't the best scenario that a person, but I was 17. What did I know? I did graduate from high school, so I'm grateful for that. But my mother started going to Al-Anon, and Al-Anon is for the family and friends of the alcoholic. And her doctor suggested that she go, and she did. And she jumped in with both feet, and she just did everything that was suggested of her to do, and it started changing the dynamics of our family. Just one person. You might not think just what one person can do. It can affect your family in a positive way, and it can affect your family in a negative way. And after all those years of the drinking being negative, her jumping into this new program, it was amazing. And she went to Al-Anon regularly for 2 years, and then she gave my dad an ultimatum. They had been married at that time 25 years. And she told him that she wasn't going to live like this anymore. And that she actually did leave. She left, went to her friend's house, and left a note on the table for my dad. He read the note and called my sister. My sister's the one we call. And so she came over and she said, well, I think you have a decision to make here. You're either going to continue your drinking and live alone, or you're going to get into some type of a program, and hopefully Mom will come back. And that's the choice he made. He went, at the time it was called Here in Oaks, right over here in St. Joe's. He was there for 28 days. And it was an amazing time. I was already out of the house. I had a 3-year-old son. I had to come to this family session. And I'm like, really? I don't have time for this. I went to be supportive, because that's the kind of person I am. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Everything that I was hearing was about how my dad was an alcoholic, and it's a disease, and it's progressive. I heard all this information. And I went into the bathroom with my sister, and I said, what are we doing here? She said, Dad's an alcoholic. I said, my whole life, everybody has told me he wasn't an alcoholic. Don't say anything that's going on in the house. Nobody's an alcoholic here. And then now you want me just to flip. He's an alcoholic. And also, after listening to all that stuff too, I had to take a look at my behavior and what I was doing. So what I chose to do at that point was run. I didn't take, I just put that right on the shelf. I'm already out of the house. This does not involve me. I am out of here. I'm a single mom raising my son. I don't have time for this. But my amazing mother, this little itty bitty thing, when she got married to my father, she was 90 pounds. I'm wearing her wedding ring on my pinky. That's how tiny she was. Well, she got it in her head that I needed Al-Anon. So my daughter, I had my son, and then my daughter was a baby, and she wanted me to go to this meeting Monday night in Milan. She wanted me to go. I said, well, what time is it? Well, it's at 8 o'clock. And I said, oh, I can't possibly go at 8 o'clock. That's when I put my daughter to bed. And she said, well, maybe her father can put her to bed. Maybe you can put her to bed at 7. But I got it. I knew that I was going to this meeting because she wasn't going to let up. That's how she was. So I went. In this meeting, it was beautiful. The people were so welcoming and warm, and there were 2 tables. There was one table that was the first step table that I had to sit at. And then there was another table. I don't know what they were talking about, but they were laughing, having a great time. So I was sure that I needed to be at the laughing table, not at this crying table. And I am a crier. I've done a lot of crying. I do a lot of crying. And just coming into the fellowship, that side of the fellowship, I did a lot of crying. But they're tears of healing. You know, sometimes, like it said on here, we wanted to avoid the grief. We don't want to have to deal with it. But sometimes for me, I've learned it's actually harder to keep it all bottled up. It's much easier for me to just cry, get it over with. I'll feel better after the cry. You know, people understand. I have a lot of understanding people in my life. But the one death that has made probably the most, it was my first really hard death, was of my son. He was 23 years old, and he was a drug addict. And he started using when he was 13 years old. And I didn't know that he was using. He was pretty slick. I thought I knew everything, you know, because I had experienced life. Yeah, right. No, I didn't. I was busy trying to be a mom, you know, and a wife and a daughter and do all these things. And I just totally did not get his addiction until he got in trouble at school. He was buying some pot from somebody at school, and he got busted. And so I had to go to school, and nothing really happened to him. They kind of just slapped him on the wrist, told him to stop using, you know, just say no. But that didn't work with him. The addiction kicked in pretty quick for him. And it was a bit of a roller coaster with his addiction. He was selling drugs and got into a lot of trouble. And at one point, his journey of recovery began. I had tried to get him help before he got in trouble with the law, and that he would not. I mean, I would take him to places. I would take him to anything, therapists. He would just sit there. He wouldn't talk. He'd just sit there. And they would tell me, they would get frustrated and say, no, we can't help him. He doesn't want help. But once he got in trouble with the law, it was no longer mom that was on his back. He had a choice. He could choose to get into recovery, or he could choose to go to a detention facility for a minimum of 9 months. Now, sometimes he did not make very good choices, but this time I believe he did, because he said, no, I will go into treatment. I'll go into treatment. I'll do what I have to do. And I was really proud of him. He did. He cleaned up. And for a year and a half, he went to meetings. He went to school, which was different for him. He had a whole entire year that he only got 1 credit for gym. So him going to school and getting his grades up and doing really well, I mean, it was just a phenomenal change. I got my son back. And I was so hopeful that we were just going to just continue on this road, because I already had seen my dad get on that road and stay on that road. When my father passed away, he passed away with 27 years sobriety. And I'm so proud of him. And today, I have 18 years of sobriety. So I knew that my son could do it if he put his mind to it. But this disease is cunning, baffling, and it's powerful, and it lies. It lies. It says you're having fun. It says it's wonderful, it's glamorous, nobody's going to get hurt. Or another big lie, it tells the actual person that's using, you're only hurting yourself. I think that's the biggest lie of all, because it's not true. Every time that my son would walk out that door and I knew what he was doing, it was hurting me. Sometimes I felt like it was hurting me more than it was hurting him, because he wasn't feeling it. He didn't realize the gravity of a lot of the situations. He never did, and he doesn't today, because he's gone. We've had to pick up the pieces as a family, and it's been very difficult. But if it wasn't for the support systems that are in place, I would have never made it. When I got that phone call, he was homeless, actually. And I had gotten many phone calls. He tried to commit suicide. I mean, I had just gotten many, many phone calls that I jumped to attention to every one of them and did what I could to try to help him. It never, ever, ever worked. It never helped. Nothing. I did what they told me to do. I did what they told me not to do. None of it worked, because he didn't want it. He didn't want it. 5 months before he died, he came in and he lived with my husband and I and my daughter and my youngest son. And we had just hoped, because he was homeless, we had just hoped that he would want to get better, that would be enough, that would be a bottom enough. I was hoping that was his bottom, being homeless. But it wasn't. It wasn't. He really, truly did not. He walked. We dropped him off at Dawn Farm for rehab. He walked all the way home. We live in Milan. He said, they told me I was okay. Just go to meetings. Here's the paper. He had a paper. The paper did say go to meetings. It didn't. I think he just heard, it's okay. I'm okay. Just go to meetings. But I knew that wasn't going to work. So I had to do one of the hardest things I've ever had to do in my life. I had to kick him out of my house. I gave him many, many chances. Many, 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 many chances. And finally, one night, I just sat him down and I said, you are killing me. You are killing me. I cannot watch you kill yourself and self-destruct like this. You're taking the whole family down. I can't do it anymore. And I begged him, please go into rehab somewhere, anywhere. I will fly you anywhere, any facility, I don't care what it is. Please, please, please go. And he said no. He said, if you take me somewhere, I will walk. So I said, okay. I said, well, then you have to leave. And I went downstairs and I got a laundry basket. And I put his clothes in the laundry basket, the clean clothes that I had washed, gave him a little bit of money. And I asked him one more time, I said, Brent, please go to rehab, please. And he said, no, Mom, I like getting high and I like drinking and I'm not going to stop. And I said, even if it kills you? And he thought about it for a minute and he said, I am not afraid to die. I said, okay, there's nothing more I can do for you. I love you. I hugged him. I kissed him. He hugged me, kissed me. We both told each other that we loved each other. And he walked out that door. And exactly 1 week later, I got that phone call that he was gone. He died. I have such guilt over that. I have such, when they're little, when the kids are little and they fall, you can kiss their boo-boo, put a little Band-Aid on it, give them a hug. They can get back up and get it going. But when they get bigger, their problems are bigger. And I can't solve it. There's no way I couldn't solve. The problems were too big. I could be a support, I could help, but he didn't want my help. And so this is what happened. I wanted to die after he died. I thought, what's the point? What is the point? I can't do this. I don't want to do this. But my husband, bless his heart, every morning, he would kick me out of the bed. He'd say, it's time for you to go to work. And I said, surely they'll understand if I don't come to work. He said, surely they will understand, but you need to get out of bed and you need to go to work. And he was right. If he wouldn't have been there, I probably wouldn't have got up. But the strange thing happens when something horrible happens in a person's life. It can go either way. You could turn it into something positive, or you could just die. And I've seen mothers that do choose to just die, and fathers. But something in me, I think it was all the years in Al-Anon that my mother had instilled in me, all those years of trying to help people. That's what it's all about, helping people. My mother used to say, we're not here just to be here. We're here to help people. And I said, you know what, you're right. I've got a new audience here. I got an audience that there's young people that need to hear about my son. They need to hear about that using and abusing drugs can kill you. So what I did is I wrote a book. It's called Brent's World. And it's about his life from my perspective, being the mother. And what I do is I go to schools, detention centers, churches, wherever they'll have me. And I do a presentation talking about my son and what it has done to our family, his death. And it's been very positive. One gal, the very first school I talked at was in Walled Lake, and it was 10th graders. They had just gotten done taking their SATs, and then they threw them in a auditorium, and then I gave my talk. And after each talk, I do give out information how they can get a hold of me if they need to. And this one gal, Michelle, bless her little heart, she contacted me. Her dad was an alcoholic. So she kind of understood what I was talking about, and it rang a bell with her. And her and I have been in contact ever since. And she's married now, and she's well on her way of having a very healthy, productive life, even though she lived in the home that she lived in. So you know what? Everything that has happened, just knowing that I could help that one person, my little Michelle, it makes all that pain. It doesn't make the pain go away, but it makes it worth something. I'm not going through this pain for nothing. I'm going through this pain, but I'm going to get on the other side. And I'm going to help some people. And there's going to be some people along the way that are going to go through the same stuff I have. And I mentor a lot of mothers that lose their children. And I just got a phone call before I came here tonight. One of the gals just lost her son. And so she wants me to be at the church on Saturday with her. And I said, absolutely, I'll be there with you. Because there's something about losing a child that is very different than the other losses that I've had. And I'm not negating the pain of other losses, because loss is loss. But there's something that another mother that has been through just sitting with you. I don't even have to say a word. All I will do is just sit with her. Sit. Hug her, sit. Sit, sit, sit. Just so she knows. And then she can visibly see me. And she can see that I'm still getting up. I'm still going to work. I'm still getting a shower. I'm still going to meetings. It's something that she can pattern her life when it's time. That's another thing. It takes a long time. Long time. I don't even think I'm ever going to be over this. It does get easier. And the most tolerable it is for me is when I can help another person. When I can help a young person, or when I can help another mother, or even another addict or alcoholic. I go to a lot of meetings, Al-Anon and AA. And I'm very, very frank about everything that I'm going through. I put it right out there on the table. Because secrets will keep you sick. People die over secrets. It's not worth it. It's not worth it today. Today, I want to be of service. That's my goal in life, to be of service and to help people. And I've got another reason now to be hopeful. I've got a grandson, my little Mikey. He's 2. He's 2. Whew. He's a handful. Somebody told me, don't say terrible 2, say terrific 2. Okay, terrific 2. And I volunteered to take him to Myrtle Beach on an airplane in July. And my husband and I just got back from Vegas, and I was watching this weekend while we were in the airport all the steps we have to go through. And I thought, oh my, I'm not sure we can do this. I think I bit off more than I can chew. So anyway, his mother and father are driving, and I didn't want little Mikey to spend 15 hours in a car. That's why I volunteered, I will fly with him. Well, he may be driving 15 hours back home with his parents. I'm just really grateful. I'm grateful to Dawn Farm. There's so many people Dawn Farm have helped. They couldn't help my son because he didn't want it, but their hand was extended, and I'm so grateful for that. I'm grateful for all these educational series. It's amazing the amount of information and support that we can get. We never, ever, ever have to do another thing by ourselves unless we want to. We really don't. There is so much hope. And I hope, even though I've been through this tremendous loss, I hope that you can hear in my voice that I have not given up and that I have a lot of hope. And I actually have a great life today. It's a sober life. My home is sober. If I have anything to say about it, this grandson will never see his mother use ever. And that gives me hope. But I can't do it by myself. And I don't want to do it by myself. And I don't want any of you, if anybody's in here struggling, it's not a weakness to ask for help. It's a weakness when we say no to the help, because it could kill you. So I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you, everyone that came out. And thanks again, Jess. You're awesome. Thank you.